Hey moms and dads, Dr. Scott back here with the next edition in your training on inflammatory foods and anti-inflammatory nutrition. So in this section, it needs to be about application. This is what we call going to the grocery store, the hard part. So what we want to do is we want to start looking at what are the things that we need to have on our watch list. When we're going through the grocery store, what are the things that we must know about so that we know what we need to avoid? And believe me, moms and dads, it is more complicated than what it seems. So we're going to start by laying foundations in terms of when you go to the grocery store, you're picking up items off the shelf and you're looking at things, you will have a very clear picture in terms of what you need to keep your eyes on, what you want to avoid for certain, because everything that we're putting on here are things that the research has said conclusively are dangerous foods to your health. So I'm going to go ahead, we're going to start the slideshow. And so as we dig in here, moms and dads, we're going to go through this. But I want you to understand that this is not a comprehensive list, but it gives you a really solid overview. If you see things on here and you have questions, what I want you to do is put in the comments beneath things that you have questions about, because one of the things that will happen is that when we talk about this in the forum, everybody learns together. So if you see something that you have additional questions about, you feel like somebody else would benefit from hearing answers about it, put it in the comments beneath or put it into the community forum. We'll talk about these things, break these down, and get the information out to everyone. So first and foremost, refined grains. We know without a shadow of a doubt that refined grains are dangerous. And there's a number of different reasons why, but here's a couple of big ones that you want to keep in mind. So number one, especially when you talk about refined grains, they're extremely high in omega-6 fatty acids. They tend to be very, very, very processed. Interestingly enough, things like white bread and pretzels and a lot of that stuff, they are as high on the glycemic index as candy. Look it up. It's really interesting. These things sit at the very top of the glycemic index. Like your white bread, they strip out any and all nutrient values so that when you eat white bread, it literally breaks down to sugar within a matter of moments. So now what you're effectively doing is you're basically taking in something that has the same sugar content as eating a candy bar. And in some cases even higher, because the glycemic index levels for these things are in the very, very high levels. So your blood sugar will spike almost immediately. And any of you who have these things in your diet on a regular basis, you recognize this because you have that 2-hour cycle, right? You eat the food, so you have that sugar rush for a little while, and then about 2 hours afterwards, you have a bad crash. It's because these foods all spike your blood sugar constantly. So it's these inflammatory grains, the cereal grains, it's the crackers, it's the processed foods, the donuts, all of this stuff here. These are very inflammatory grains, extremely dense in omega-6 fatty acids, but also considering even the way that these things are processed. When you look at the cereal grains, right? So they add tons of sugar and dyes, additives, trans fats, the same thing with the bakery. When you look at the bakery, so the bakery is processed so heavily. We'll talk about this a little bit later on in the module, but they use all kinds of inflammatory fats in addition to the dyes, in addition to the sugars. So in general, avoiding these types of grains are an absolute must because it's literally impossible to have these be a staple in your diet and be a healthy individual. Now, here's some great replacements because, I know that if you have children, right? Children love to go and have their crackers and their breads and their pastas. There are things that you can use that are very good replacements. So if you can see up here on the top left side of the screen, you see Ezekiel bread. And Ezekiel bread is a great replacement. My kids eat Ezekiel bread as their form of bread. Now, it's a wheat bread, but here's the big difference. It is a sprouted grain, which means it is a live grain. It is entirely different. This is an organic, non-GMO food product. It's in its most natural form. And one big difference between foods that are sprouted versus non-sprouted, which are flour-based. So a sprouted grain is essentially an alive food. It has all of the enzymes, everything that your body needs to break it down. Enzymes, especially when it comes to whole foods, like these whole live grains, they act as companions to help your body to digest the proteins and other components that come with the wheat. So there are enzymes that are present in these sprouted grains that your body uses naturally when you eat a sprouted grain to break down things like gluten and gliadin that we don't make the enzymes for naturally, which is one of the reasons why it becomes so irritating to us. So if you eat things like this, they're going to be far easier on your system. Now, if you have celiac disease, don't eat these. Avoid wheats in general. But if you have a suspected sensitivity, then you can eat this as your wheat replacement and you will probably do just fine. I know that I have some pretty severe issues with gluten. I tolerate this with no issues at all. You see on the top right-hand side, you see the multigrain crackers. These are a good alternative. Now, listen, crackers in general should not be a staple, but I get it. Every once in a while, you want something crunchy. These are a really good alternative. They taste fantastic. They are minimally processed. They're gluten-free. So the fats they use in them, not bad. So you can eat something like this, have your kids eat something like this, not have a lot of guilt, but it should not be something to eat in large quantities. Small quantities, because portion control is really difficult when you talk about any kind of a grain. If you look down at the bottom, you've got alternatives to like granolas and snacks, like Kind makes a great gluten-free granola. You see down here in the bottom, Nature's Path also makes a grain-free granola. So you're talking about two different ways to go and get the tastiness of granola, one without grain and one that is using oats, but it's organic and it's non-GMO. So Kind makes a really good product. Now for pasta tends to be one of those things where it's a bit harder replacement. But there's a lot of great alternatives that in the last few years have hit the marketplace. One of the best alternatives are using bean pastas. Obviously, chickpea pastas like you see here with Banza are a great alternative. But there's also things like red lentil and green lentil pastas, which I eat on a regular basis. I think they're fantastic. Especially if you are someone who is a vegetarian or a vegan, these are tremendous choices. It's a one ingredient pasta, just the beans. And they don't do anything else to it. You literally just have the bean that they will turn into a noodle. So if you want to have a pasta, great alternative, very filling. So you won't overeat on it in most cases. It tends to be very, very low on the glycemic index. This is an important piece. Because of how dense this is, because of how much fiber beans naturally have, it's going to be a low glycemic index food. So this is a really good alternative. And I know it was something when I'm a pasta lover. And so when I saw that these kind of things hit the market, it was great because I had to intentionally avoid all pastas for a long period of time because a lot of the gluten-free alternatives were still super high in the glycemic index because you looked at like rice pastas. They taste good, but because it's made of rice is extremely high on the glycemic index, and it's also high in omega-6 fatty acids. So I tried to avoid those because of the fact that, if you want to have a pasta, they can become inflammatory. Now, beans are still high in omega-6s. But here's the deal. If they're low on the glycemic index, it's not hard to counterbalance them by using things like omega-3 rich foods. Like you add in avocado oil, you add in olive oil, and those are very dense in omega-3s. You put in things that help to go and balance this out. It's not hard to do once you understand how to do this. There are certain things that are just absolute must avoids in your diet. And here's one big thing that I want you to understand is trans fatty acids are hidden. And I mean it quite explicitly, they are hidden. You have to look at these things and you have to look carefully at the labels. And so when you look at trans fats, they're not going to say, I'm a trans fat. It's going to say I am a partially hydrogenated fat or a fully hydrogenated fat. If you see hydrogenated, put it back on the shelf, walk away and never eat it again. The deal that you're going to run into is that it's in a lot of the foods that most of us eat quite commonly. Baked goods are laden with these. You see it in all kinds of baked goods, all kinds of crackers, all kinds of chips, because they're used as a flavor enhancer. They add texture. They're really hard to avoid. So you have to be a label reader. That's why as we look through a lot of these sections, you see I post the labels because they want you to know where to look. It's always in the bottom. And if you see hydrogenated, partially hydrogenated, completely avoid it. And so as we start digging into these things, we know a couple of major things about trans fats. So they are proven without a shadow of a doubt that they cause atherosclerosis. So you need to know that there are certain big things that you have to be on the lookout for in terms of foods. So when you look at things like your baked goods, they tend to be rampant in baked goods. They tend to be in a lot of your frozen foods. They tend to be in a lot of your crackers, and margarine for sure always has this. So if you're looking at things like cookies, okay, if you're looking at bakery, if you see on there that those things are on them, you're going to really want to avoid this. Now, the great thing is that there are more foods that are coming on the market that don't use a lot of these hydrogenated oils, but it's something that there's no safe amount to this. If it's in your system, it's going to cause harm. And when you look at a lot of these more processed foods, also realize that you get multiple different inflammatory things within these processed foods. That's why we want to limit processed foods in general in our diet. Because even if you look at like the Ritz cracker label on here, you can see things like wheat flour, right? You see things like palm oil, which is another oil that can be inflammatory. Soybean oil can be inflammatory oil. They use sugar. You see hydrogenated cottonseed oil. So when you look at cottonseed oil is extremely, extremely inflammatory. It is one of the most inflammatory oils that there is. So if you see this, know it's one that you want to avoid. And you say to yourself, so if these companies know that these things are inflammatory, why did they add them in? That's a great question. They do know that these things are inflammatory, but they choose to keep them in there because they're cheap. And so all of the ingredients that you look at in things like a Ritz cracker, it's because of cost. They are able to bring the cost down by adding in high fructose corn syrup, by adding in these inflammatory oils, all of these things because they are cheap and they are good flavor enhancers. The problem is that there's no consideration for the health benefits, or in this case, the health robbing effects that these foods have. Margarine, same thing. It's all inflammatory. They try to sell these things as being healthy alternatives. They are not, because they use these hydrogenated oils as their primary form of fat. So you want to avoid those. High fructose corn syrup. Many of you have heard about high fructose corn syrup, and some of you might know about some of its impact, but I want to bring this into reality. As high fructose corn syrup entered our diet, in step with it, our obesity rates went through the roof, because fructose enters our body in a very different pathway than glucose does. It's not regulated the same way that glucose is. Your body has control mechanisms for glucose. So when we consume glucose, it does not go through the same pathway, and it creates a real major league set of issues, because it has a million different problems in terms of the way that it gets in. It can cause all kinds of issues with increasing abdominal fat. It's processed entirely differently than glucose doesn't turn into glycogen. So fructose is almost immediately processed and turned right into abdominal fat and in other areas. And it creates significant amounts of antioxidants, because it does not take much to consume a lot of high fructose corn syrup. And so the longer that stuff sits in our bloodstream, the more free radical damage that it will create. And free radical damage is what drives the vast majority of these chronic health issues that we're seeing. So we want to really make sure that we're looking at labels to find high fructose corn syrup. And so you have to look carefully, because it's hidden in things that we wouldn't expect. If you see on here, here's just 3 examples. So barbecue sauce. Most barbecue sauces, their primary sweetener, like Sweet Baby Ray's, taste delicious, but sweetened heavily with high fructose corn syrup. So Campbell's soup. So they use high fructose corn syrup. Coca-Cola and most sugary drinks use high fructose corn syrup. Now, when you talk about the sugary drinks, that's not the only issue, but in this context, understanding that it's the primary thing they use for their sweetener, for no other reason than that, get rid of pop entirely. There is no good amount of pop in your diet, period. You want to expand upon that even further, right? And look at this here. It says 1 bottle, right? And so the bottle size on here, they say 240 calories. That is 65 grams of sugar. 65 grams, all simple sugars. And so based upon the FDA, RDAs for your carbohydrates, that's 22% of your daily consumption of carbohydrates in one serving. And in reality, that's higher than what you should be taking in simple sugars, period, in an entire day. That is an extremely high amount. But keep in mind, too, that every time you have a soda, pop, whatever you prefer to call it, it creates massive issues with blood sugar regulation and massive free radical damage. And then you add on to the fact that they use for the fizz, they use this stuff called carbonic acid. Well, the other major issue that creates is that every time you have carbonic acid, your body has to take this stuff called phosphorus from your bones to bring your pH levels back into a normal range, because pop is extremely acidic. So then your body has to go and take phosphorus from your bones. And so you do this over a long enough period of time, it destroys bone density and you end up with osteoporosis, whether you're a man or a woman. So a couple of major issues that you want to watch there. Inflammatory oils. So these are things that we've talked about in some of the other videos, but I want to dive into now, because you want to really keep these things out of your diet if at all possible. But these are challenging because they are literally everywhere. Corn oil, safflower, sunflower, cottonseed, peanuts, soybean, and canola. We've talked about corn oil. We've talked about canola. I just mentioned about cottonseed oil. So major league inflammatory oil. Peanut oil is very inflammatory, super dense in omega-6s. Soybean oil, also not a great alternative for a number of different issues because it's potentially a phytoestrogen, which can cause estrogen dominance. If you are a researcher, you like to look at the literature, this is the one where you're going to find probably the most conjecture on. Because if you look at literature on one side, it says phytoestrogen increases the risk for cancer because it can mess with your estrogen dominance. And then if you have estrogen dominance, it can trigger estrogen-sensitive breast cancers. I'm going to not necessarily say on one side or the other because the evidence is murky at best at this point. So if it's murky and there's conjecture, avoid it, especially because soybeans, by and large, are non-organic and GMO. So if you can keep them out of your diet, do the best you can. But it's hard because they use soy lecithin, they use soybean oil, it's everywhere. Sunflower oil is one where we're going to put a little bit less of a negative on it because sunflower oil derived from sunflower seeds, if you have it mixed, it's not as bad. It's omega-6 dense. But if you have it with omega-3s, we're not going to be quite as concerned, but still want to limit it because it is an inflammatory oil. Now, it's everywhere. You have to look super carefully because it's in things that we use every single day. And it's extremely, extremely prevalent in condiments. When you look at things like your dressings and your mayonnaise and all of these things, you're going to see these oils are there constantly. And so if you look at things like even the Italian dressing on the bottom, you see things like palm oil, soybean oil, canola oil, and olive oil. So there's mixes of oils. But when you look at even things like the mayonnaise label off to the right side, you see that you've got in there canola oil. There's a number of different types of oils in there. There's a lot of different things in each one of these where you see a lot of soy oils. So they're very, very prevalent, all in different concentrations. That's why you scour the label from top to bottom to see, number one, are they present, and two, how much? And that becomes a big piece of understanding these labels. We look at the label in descending order. The higher up on the label that it is, the more of it there is. The lower it goes, the less there is. It doesn't mean that because it's low on the label that it's okay, but it does mean that it's going to be a lower concentration. So then we have different decisions to make if we're going to use a condiment. Because as most of us would agree, it's pretty darn hard to avoid condiments in our diet because they're good flavor enhancers. We enjoy them on our salads. We enjoy them with our foods. We enjoy them on our burgers and things like that. The great thing is that there are a lot of alternatives that are coming out of the market because people are becoming more health conscious. And so if you go into your salad dressing aisle and you start looking at the labels, you'll find more and more and more of these are going to avocado oil, olive oil, other non-inflammatory oils to try and get these things out. And you're seeing the ingredient lists go down as people are demanding that more healthy food alternatives, more healthy condiments start to enter the marketplace. It took some time, but there's finally a large amount of these things that are starting to hit the shelves. So no matter where you live, if you start scouring the shelves, looking for these things, you'll see they're starting to really become prevalent. Now, what I would do is most of us are very brand specific and we love our brands and we're used to our brands and we're used to what they are. Start trying these other things and start working them into your diet. It's going to be a different flavor. I'm not saying bad. Because to be quite honest, as I've eaten a lot of these, they're a really nice, they're a pleasant change because the majority of these are made with a lot of care. The people that are the producers of a lot of these better products, they care heavily about quality and health. So they make a delicious product. You know, one of the things that my family really enjoys is a Greek vinaigrette. Now, you know, with Greek vinaigrettes, you're always going to look at, there's going to be some inflammatory things because they put cheeses and stuff like that in there that can be inflammatory. But when you look at the oils, right, the Greek vinaigrette that we use, it only uses olive and avocado oil. So non-inflammatory oils, things that are very dense in omega-3s. Few ingredients, mostly seasonings. If you see that's the list, give it a try. It's definitely worthwhile to see, do you like these things? In terms of mayonnaise, so we use an avocado oil mayonnaise, and it's only 3 or 4 ingredients. And I'll make sure to post it on here in one of the follow-up videos so that you can see this. And the great thing about it is I like it better than the other mayos. It tastes fantastic, goes great with anything that you would normally use mayonnaise for, whether you're making tuna, whether you're making a turkey sandwich, if you're making, you know, your potato salads and your pasta salads. It is a great alternative. And the best part about it is that your family and your loved ones, they will never know the difference. So you'll start making everyone healthier by putting better quality ingredients in, and they'll be none the wiser, except for the fact that we have, because ironically, I'm not getting sick less, or boy, my cholesterol has gone down quite a bit from where it had been over the last few months, or boy, I just feel better, or, you know, my doctor said that I may not need to be on these meds anymore, because all of these little changes, they add up to profound changes in terms of your physiology. So another one that we have to talk about, and this is a big one, simple sugars. Simple sugars are literally everywhere. And any kind of a processed, packaged, bottled, whatever it is, if it's a Lunchable, if it is a microwave meal, all of these things are loaded with simple sugars. So you're going to really want to start scouring the labels. Like we talked about before, the higher that the sugar is on the list, the more you want to avoid it. So for example, you see it on here on the Pepsi label. Ingredient number 1, water. Ingredient number 2, high fructose corn syrup. So ingredient number 3, caramel color. Ingredient number 4, sugar. So they're double sugaring this. 1, high fructose corn syrup. Number 2 is going to be your sucrose, table sugar. So all of these things, when you look at these, this is going to be the same type of an algorithm that you're going to see in a lot of these processed foods. Mountain Dew, same thing, very similar in its formulation. Even this kid cuisine, right, marketed to our children. But when you look at the ingredients on here, on every single one of these sections, sugar is high on the list. And you see it in a number of different ways. They'll say it as cornstarch. They'll say it as dextrose. If you see starch, if you see sugar, if you see dextrose, if you see maltodextrin, all of these things, they are sugars. There's a number of different ways they're going to label it. But when you look, especially on this kid cuisine, in every section, in every ingredient, you see there is sugar used as a flavor enhancer. So it's really important that we look at trying to get away from the packaged foods. If it's something where it's been processed in a factory, they're going to use inflammatory oils. They're going to use sugar. They use chemicals that are going to be inflammatory that we're going to want to avoid. Plus, not even to account for the salt content and all of the other things, the flavor enhancers and the preservatives they add in. And we'll dig into those things in other sections, but there's just literally no health value to these things. And then nitrate and nitrite containing foods. If you've never heard about this, this is something that we need to expand upon, because nitrates and nitrates are something that are in a lot of the foods that are commonly eaten, but we really need to on purpose avoid these, because nitrates and nitrites are strongly associated with colon cancer. There's also a strong connection with PEDS into a blood disorder called a methylglobulinemia. And it's when they talk about blue babies, where a child's body is not able to hold on to oxygen in their blood. It's a really nasty condition. It can be life-threatening to a lot of the children that develop this. So avoiding these things pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, after pregnancy, super important. But in general, for your health, avoid nitrates. Now, let me put a positive spin, because so many people are also aware of the dangers of nitrates and nitrites. There are a lot of companies out there that are starting to make these meat products without the processed ingredients like the nitrates and the nitrites. So if you look in Costco, for example, or some of the larger big box stores or Whole Foods, you're going to see there are going to be a lot of your lunch meats where they say on the label, no nitrates, no nitrites, minimally processed. You're seeing a lot of these types of foods come to the marketplace now without having all of these additives. And so the good thing is that they're becoming more readily available. If you go to your chain grocery stores, Dietz and Watson tends to be one of the ones that's more commonly available, where they have nitrate and nitrite-free lunch meats. But lunch meats in general are just laden with these. Bacon, by a long shot, laden with these. Smoked meat, laden with these. So you really want to try to intentionally avoid these types of things in your diet, because without a shadow of a doubt, we know that this is associated with an increased risk of colon cancer. And so if we can modify things like our risk for colon cancer simply by removing ingredients like this and finding a healthier alternative, and the great thing is they're readily available now, we can change things. And as we've talked about before in the section on calming our kids' brains and building healthy children, we talked about the concept of epigenetics. Changing what we put into our bodies changes gene expression. Well, guess what, guys? Cancer is an alteration in gene expression. If you change the environment in your body, it decreases the likelihood of your genes going wonky and you developing cancer. These little changes can literally alter your future in ways that you can never imagine at this point in time. So moms and dads, I hope that this information was helpful to you. If you have additional questions, drop it in the comments section. Let's dig in. We can flush through this together. If you're looking for alternatives, let me know. I've got tons of them. I've been doing this for a very long time in my own life, in my own family. I happen to be the cook in my home, so I help my kids to be able to go and find healthy foods that avoid these things. Now, are we 100%? No, because it's darn near impossible. But we follow the 90-10 rule. Well over 90% of the time, we're clean. At maximum in a week, no more than 10% of the time. But listen, every once in a while, we're going to have a processed food. It's life, if we're traveling, if we're out. Or, my kids just have a taste for something that's a cheat food. We give small allowances for this, but we do not allow it in our diets in high quantities because we know that we can only control the internal environment if we control the majority of the variables the majority of the time. So make sure that in this next few days, try to start looking at the labels, start applying these principles, and then start looking at what can I do to add in things to my diet or subtract things to my diet to start swapping out some of these inflammatory compounds that I have in my diet on a daily and weekly basis. You will be amazed at how your body will start to feel better almost immediately when you stabilize your blood sugar, when you're having less inflammatory oils, when you start getting the nitrates and the nitrites out of your body. And you'll start noticing that your body will just begin to heal and you will start feeling and functioning better. All right, guys. So I'm going to get out of here. I will see you on the next module. Have a great day.